I'm Christer Nordlund, Professor of History of Science and Ideas at this department in Umeå. And I'm sitting here together with Ludmilla Jordanova, the author of the book History in Practice, which we are using at this course, which is basically about history in practice. It's about writing and reading, and it's about different skills you need to know as historians, like interpretation, contextualization, source criticism, how to make a footnote, and such things. And we have been reading your book, and I thought now when you're here as a visiting professor at the department, it would be a good idea to have a little chat with you. So very much welcome.
Thank you, and hello everybody.
The first thing I was thinking about is that although the book is very broad, it's about history in the broader sense, including public history, you, as a student, you began turning into a historian through the study of history and philosophy of science in Cambridge.
Yes.
Yes. So how come that you did choose that particular field of history?
So I didn't know then that I wanted to become a historian. That's the short answer. And I thought it would be a good idea to take the natural sciences tripos at Cambridge. And I didn't enjoy it very much, as it turned out. And in the second year, it's possible to take a course in the history and philosophy of science. And as soon as I started doing that, I realized this was something I found completely fascinating and that I wanted to continue studying. So then in my third year, I could take the whole of my studies were devoted to the history and philosophy of science. And in my third year, I was taught by Roy Porter, and he had been trained as a historian, but was doing his PhD on the history of geology. And it was through knowing him that I realized I would like to become more of a historian and not just a historian of science.
But you did your PhD then in history and philosophy of science on, say, natural philosophy in the 19th century?
Late 18th and early 19th centuries. Yeah.
And after that, then you sort of turned into, one can say, history of medicine?
Yes.
But as far as I know, you did not take up a position at the HPS department then?
No, there were no positions that I could take up. I had a research fellowship in Cambridge, and I did a lot of teaching when I was a research fellow. Also when I was a research student. And I taught for the history department, I taught for the education department, I taught a course on history of education, and I taught history of science. And there were not that many jobs then. So the first job I had after I was a research fellow was in the history of medicine, and then I was very, very lucky in 1980 to get a job in the history department. And after 1980, for more than 10 years, there were no jobs in history departments at all. And then when new universities came on stream, these were former polytechnics, then it began to open up again, but that wasn't until the early 1990s.
So how would you define your identity as a historian today?
Well, I still like to say that I'm a historian of science, because that foundation is extremely important to me. And it's also a way of drawing to people's attention what an important field the history of science is.
Take that one.
So congratulations to the third edition of the book, which I have read and used and liked very much. How would you say that this book, sort of, in your opinion, what makes the book stand out if you compare it to other books in the genre of history about history or history as a practice?
Okay. So I see it as completely different from most of the other books. And there are, I think, a number of different features there. Some of it is in the book's design. So, for example, there aren't little boxes on the pages, which is quite characteristic now of textbooks. So every time I've done a new edition, I've resisted the publisher asking me to put in features that are more like a textbook. So I want it to be a book that people can read, a grown-up book if you like. It also has quite distinctive illustrations in. For the third edition, a lot of the illustrations are taken from Durham's own collections. Durham University in the UK is where I am currently employed, which are very international. And I wanted to show students some different ways that they might think about the past through those illustrations. I also think the topics that it deals with are very, very distinctive. It's now much more common to have chapters on public history, but when I published the first edition, which came out in 2000, none of the other general books about history in English had a separate chapter on public history. It also has a lot more on the relationship between history and other disciplines than most other books have. I think I really take that seriously. And in this new edition, there's a whole chapter on history in a digital age. And I think it's also the first book, not to mention digital history, but to devote a chapter to it and to look at it in the round. So I try to suggest that we are digital historians when we use a library catalogue, for example, but we're also digital historians when we use a historical database, and we have to try and think about all of those together in the same breath, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, digital history is now growing. It's also expanding here at this university, thanks to we have a certain sort of department here called Lab, which is devoted to digital humanities in the broad sense, including digital history. But do you think that your background as a historian of science has shaped the way you composed the book?
Yes, I do think that my background in the history of science has shaped the book in many ways. When I was trained as a historian of science, there were very close affinities with intellectual history and the history of ideas. And I really try and make sure that is part of the book. So, for example, in the third edition, I talk about Christopher Bailey, who's one of the historians that I most admire. And one of his last books was about liberal ideas in India. And I think this is something that a lot of historians would just simply not run across. So that predisposition, I think, to take ideas, to take philosophy very seriously. I have quite a lot to say about Charles Taylor, for example, the philosopher. And I think, again, that gives the book quite a distinctive cast. But I also think that being a historian of science has alerted me to some other things. So, for example, in the chapter on digital history, I talk a bit about how the history of technology might help us understand the emergence of digital history. So I cite, for example, John Agar's book on the mobile phone. So it's just a very short book, but I think it really alerts history students to why understanding the technology is important. Now, obviously, in a book of that kind, you can't go into a lot of detail about the history of technology. But I think to alert history students to the importance of that field is a really valuable thing to do.
And another of your interests that you have developed a lot during the last years, few decades, is the way of using visual artifacts as historical sources, exploring what you call visual culture. Can you describe some of the possibilities that open up for us as scholars or students when we include such artifacts as sources in the study of history?
Yes. So one way of approaching that might be to turn the question a little bit and to say, why would we not use such sources? Because they're in all cultures, from what we know, material culture and visual culture have been incredibly important. So it seems to me it requires explanation why historians have become, or at least were when the history discipline was getting established, why historians were so fixated on texts and documents. Because in the 17th century and 18th century, you get many antiquarians who are using images and objects to write about the past. So I would turn the question around and say, why not? But I am guessing that you would like me to say something a bit more specific about that. So it seems to me visual sources give us many ways of understanding everyday life, how people imagine their own identities, how they give value to things, what their world was like. If we think about attitudes to colour, for example, I mean, there are a lot of historians, it's not something I particularly talk about in the book, but a lot of historians are now interested in how ideas about colour have developed. So we can think of endless examples. For people who work on earlier periods, I would always keep reminding them that in churches, for example, maybe not so much in Northern Europe, but certainly in the Catholic world, churches are full of visual culture, and this was seen by everybody. People who were servants in palaces or aristocratic homes, they too had access to quite sophisticated forms of visual culture. So I think the possibilities are absolutely endless.
Yes, and I agree. And maybe it might be that during the 20th century we had a very more and more strict division of labor between different fields of scholarship. So we had art historians, literary historians, archaeologists, of course, and then all the different new branches of history. Intellectual historians focusing on the ideas, history of technology on technology, and so on and so forth. And maybe we see today more of these different fields and branches merging together more than before. So it's getting more, also more accepted for a historian to use visual sources and artifacts, of course, and making the best you can of the situation.
Yes.
Concerning your particular question.
Yes. Yes, I think that's very true. I think our attitudes have changed, and we now encourage our students to look for whatever they can find that, as you say, relates to the question. But I also think there are very strong legacies which are about intellectual hierarchies. So, for instance, the artifacts of everyday life, on the whole, have not had the same intellectual status as the documents connected with government. And so I think we're trying to overcome those hierarchies, or to challenge those hierarchies, and to see all the phenomena that the past has left us as potential sources that we can use.
So to write a book like this is quite difficult, and it takes a lot of time. How come that you decided to do this book, and why do you think it was needed when you did it?
I think that's a very good question. I was invited to submit a proposal to a publisher. The publisher is called Edward Arnold. It doesn't exist as a separate publisher anymore. But they had a really inspirational history editor. And he approached me and said other people had suggested that I would be a good person to write a general book about history. And would I like to submit a proposal? And I would never have come up with such an idea all by myself. And he said, explicitly, there is this E.H. Carr book, What is History? It's very old now. We'd like to be the publishers of something that can supplant it. I don't think my book has supplanted it, but I think the book is quite widely used. So the idea that there was a need for the book really came from the publishers, and the publishers perceived that there was a niche. So the first edition came out in 2000, and after that a lot of other books were published, covering some of the same ground, not exactly the same ground. But I've always been pleased to do it because I think it's helped me grow as a historian. It is true, it is very, very hard, and I've put an enormous amount of work into that. And I think often people don't value necessarily the work that we put into so-called textbooks. But I still feel now, after this book has been part of my life for 25 years, I still feel that it's been a worthwhile project.
Thank you. Was it you who came up with the title, History and Practice, or was it your publisher?
Oh, I think that's an interesting question. I think we struggled over a title, and I think the inspirational editor that I mentioned came up with the title.
And concerning visual culture, the book looks like this. how would you interpret this image?
Okay, so these are statues by a very famous British sculptor called Anthony Gormley, who is one of the most famous sculptors around at the moment. And these are figures looking out to sea. And to me, it's very evocative. I didn't choose, I didn't come up with the cover image. I wish I could say that I did. I was sent quite early on a number of options by the publishers. And I chose this one, and I think they've done a really beautiful job. And I love the idea of looking out, because I think that is what historians do, and looking out at something that has no obvious end. So you're looking out at the horizon, it's infinite. And that's surely a very good way of expressing why some of us find history such a beguiling topic, because it gets into your soul, if you like, and you never want to let it go once you've started being a historian.
Thank you.